Good. So hi again. My name is Shai Feldman. I am the director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies here. And I'm delighted to open this exciting event, which we at the Crown Center are kicking off our 13th year of operations. Our focus today would be obviously on the Middle East, as you know, but I want to say that although our focus is on the Middle East, our hearts have to be with those who are still struggling to deal with the repercussions of the disaster in Houston, and even more so with those who are suffering right now from the catastrophes in the various parts of Florida. So as you know, this year, 2017, marks the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. We mark the 70 years of the UN adoption of Resolution 181 that called for the creation of two states in Palestine, one Jewish, one Arab. And it's been 50 years since the 1967 war, at the end of which Israel found itself in control of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and also the Sinai and the Golan. Now, we're meeting here not to analyze these turning points, but to use this occasion to understand better the debates that are going on among Palestinians and among Israelis as to where their enterprises should be going in the years to come. So our second and third sessions will do exactly that. They will attempt to explore the different views held by Palestinians and by Israelis as to where their enterprise or enterprises should be going in the years to come. What are these debates about? What is being debated? And what are the views that are being expressed in the framework of these debates? But first, we have to contextualize these questions and provide a historical background to the Israeli and Palestinian debates by assessing how the Zionist enterprise developed over the last 100 years, and how the Arab world's attitude towards this enterprise evolved over the same period. To do all of this, we're very fortunate to have 6 outstanding panelists who will provide opening remarks in each of these 3 sessions. To be with us today, they've come from close and afar, and we're very grateful to them for making the effort. They'll be introduced by the session moderators, but these introductions will be very brief, so please consult your programs for the more complete, or the slightly more complete bios that you'll find in the programs. Now, in each of these 3 sessions, our speakers will present different views, and in some cases, contrasting views. We hope more contrasting views, exposing you to the differences among these scholars. And exposing you to these differences is exactly one of the most important central pillars of the Crown Center and the Crown Center's mission, which is to provide balanced and dispassionate analysis of the Middle East, a commitment that has now guided us for 12 years. But in other ways, this event is actually the first for us. It's the first time that we've co-sponsored and cooperated in holding an event with 4 other institutions outside the Brandeis campus. The Faris Center for Eastern Mediterranean Studies at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts University, the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Arizona in Tucson, the Eunice and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA, and the journal The American Interest. The event is restreamed to the followers of the Nazarian Center at UCLA and to the readers of the National Interest, but it is beamed through these cameras to halls at the Fletcher School and at the University of Arizona, where students and faculty have gathered just like we did, not only to hear us, but also to participate, and they will be coming in into our conversation in the question and answer sessions of each, or part of each of the 3 sessions. As I said, this is the first for us, and if the technology that should allow us to do this will actually work, we'll all know that, in fact, there are miracles. So regardless, I really want to thank our partners to this adventure, Adam Garfinkel, the editor of The American Interest, Ed Wright, the director of the Center for Judaic Studies in Tucson, Nadim Shahadi, the director of the Fares Center at Tufts, and Yoram Cohen, director of the Nazarian Center at UCLA. I also want to send a special thanks to Sharon Nazarian, a member of the Crown Center's advisory board. She's the founder of the Nazarian Center at UCLA, and she's also the chair of their advisory board. Also, a very, very big thank you to Jeanette and Joe Neubauer of Philadelphia, without whose generous support we would not have been able to hold this event. Beyond our financial support, Jeanette, who was in her previous life a senior vice president for corporate relations of Time Warner, provided me with very, very, very creative advice throughout the process of conceiving this event. And I would also like to thank 2 individuals on our side who've made this event possible. Karen Spira, who is the project coordinator or the program coordinator of the Crown Center, and the Crown Center's associate director, Christina Chernyhivsky. For more than 12 years now, since the Crown Center's inauguration in 2005, Christina has organized masterfully and flawlessly every Crown Center event, and we look forward to her continuing to do this in the years to come. Finally, 2 very important housekeeping notes. First of all, those of you who have not had occasion to taste the food, it'll still be there during the break. Secondly, because this event is live streamed and beamed to these remote locations, we have to adhere very strictly to the stipulated schedule, which means not only that the speakers will have to abide by the limited time available to them to present their views, but also that in the Q&A sessions, the questions actually need to be questions rather than speeches. And most importantly, it means that we would all have to be back here, back from the coffee breaks, a few minutes before the next session begins, because when the program says that the next session begins, the cameras will begin to roll so that we can all be seen in Arizona and Tufts. So there are a bunch of students that you've already seen. They're wearing this event's T-shirt, and they've been deputized to use any form of coercion to make sure that you're back in your seats on time. So with this, I just urge you to fasten your seatbelts. Wish all of us an engaging event, and I turn the mic over to the chair of the first session, Professor Eva Belin. Thank you.
Well, to our participants in Waltham and Medford, good afternoon. To our participants in Phoenix and Berkeley, good morning. My name is Eva Belin. I hold the Myra and Robert Kraft Chair in Arab Politics at the Crown Center, and I serve as professor at the Politics Department in Brandeis University. Our first session is titled Looking Back, Zionism in the Arab World. And as Shai has already noted, our two panelists will provide an overview of the first 100 years of the Zionist enterprise, as well as the evolution in the Arab world's response to that enterprise over the past century. And we are very lucky to have two scholars extraordinarily well qualified to address these two topics. First to speak will be Jehuda Reinharz. He is President Emeritus of Brandeis University and the Richard Corritt Professor of Modern Jewish History. Professor Reinharz is one of the most prominent historians of the Zionist movement. He is the author of many, many books on the subject, including the autobiography of Chaim Weizmann, Israel's first president and one of the most important leaders of the Zionist movement. After Professor Reinharz, we will welcome to the podium Abdel Monem Said Ali. Abdel Monem Said Ali is Senior Fellow at the Crown Center, and he is the former director of the Al-Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies in Cairo. This is one of the most important think tanks in the Arab world. Abdel Monem is here in his capacity as one of Egypt's most important public intellectuals. He has reflected on the issues we are discussing today countless times in the press, in broadcast media, and in scholarly formats. Most recently, in the book he co-authored with Shai Feldman and Khalil Shikaki called Arabs and Israelis, Conflict and Peacemaking in the Middle East. Now, as Shai said, you can find more complete biographical information about our panelists in the programs. Our panelists will speak each for about 20 minutes each, and then we will open up to questions. So, Professor Reinharz, may I ask you to join us?
Good afternoon. That was pretty good. In Zionism's brief history, no figure did more than Chaim Weizmann for the establishment of the State of Israel. Yet, he does not receive the recognition he deserves. If people remember Weizmann at all, they might recall an earlier episode in Weizmann's life, his major role in obtaining the Balfour Declaration in 1917, but nothing between that and his presidency. The theme of this symposium is looking back, looking forward. I'm the looking back part of this equation, and I plan to show the evolution of the Balfour Declaration from 1917 to 1949, much of which was engineered by one remarkable man. So don't ask me any questions after 1949. On October 31st, 1917, the British government authorized Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour to send a letter to Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, member of the British branch of that family, and the most prominent name in British Zionism at the time. The letter stated that His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Balfour's office prepared the text that was approved by the government, and the Foreign Secretary signed the letter on November 2nd. It was one more piece of paper, not of central importance, produced by the activist cabinet of Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Was it already then, in November 1917, the famous declaration that some see as the basis for the establishment of the State of Israel just 30 years later, and which others see as the original sin that engendered the Jewish-Arab conflict? What actually happened was, as usual, more complicated. The letter signed by Balfour was not born as the Balfour Declaration. It was made the Balfour Declaration. And it was Weizmann, a chemist and a minor figure in the English Zionist Federation, who by the end of 1917 had become the prime mover who transformed that piece of paper produced by the British cabinet into a document of exceptional historical importance. Famously, the Balfour Declaration is intimately connected to Weizmann's discovery of biological process for producing acetone, a substance essential to the British war effort. Weizmann turned the patent over to the British government, refusing any payment, a story enshrined in a brief, dramatic fragment authored by the playwright George Bernard Shaw called Arthur and the Acetone. And in the playlet, an astonished Arthur Balfour asks Weizmann, "Since you want none of the things that everybody else wants, what the devil do you want?" "I want Jerusalem," Weizmann says. Weizmann later responded that in his not at all humble memoirs, saying, "History does not deal in Aladdin lamps." An interesting response by a man who in his autobiography in 1947 took full credit for achieving the declaration. Weizmann's instincts alongside hard work made him an expert in the ins and outs of British politics and the important contours of the debates at the top levels of British government, and in particular in the cabinet. His penchant for elitism and his ability to speak with his British interlocutors at eye level, in both senses of the word, Weizmann was 6 feet tall, made him an especially influential advocate. He was a Jew through and through, but his appearance and bearing went counter to anti-Semitic stereotypes. He did not entreat, he did not ask to be pitied, did not use money as a lure. He internalized the mores of the society he lived in, less ideology, more political pragmatism, and sharp awareness of the fine points of class distinction. For that reason, and because he was a Jew, not an Englishman, Scotsman, Welshman, or Irishman, he quickly became the ultimate Briton. Weizmann understood two things: that it was important to think in terms of the British war effort, and that the neutralist policy of the World Zionist Organization was a dangerous one. With regard to the former, Weizmann studied the disagreement between those who advocated a separate armistice that would maintain the Ottoman Empire in exchange for peace on British terms, and those who favored conquering the territory of the empire before the war ended. Weizmann used the little power he had to push for a second option, a compact between Britain and Zionism, as well as between Britain and the Arabs of the Middle East, would certainly bolster the advocates of Britain becoming the imperial power in the region instead of the Turks. Weizmann was unambiguous about his position that the Zionist movement should take in the war. He refused to accept the fact that the Zionist executive had almost pathetically gone into self-imposed exile in Denmark so as not to take a side in a war in which Jews were killing other Jews on the European front. The Zionists should come down on Britain's side, he maintained. Weizmann's appointment with history began with the Balfour Letter. To a large extent, it was Weizmann who shepherded the process that was so critical for Britain, and even more so for Zionism, which principally involved the way in which the letter that Balfour wrote to Rothschild metamorphosed into a long-term binding political commitment. Weizmann understood that for the paper on which Balfour's letter was written to Lord Rothschild, action had to be taken so as to make it meaningful. British imperialism was based, all the more in wartime, on useful connections between agents of benefit, local clients, whose interests overlapped with those of the British. In this way, Britain, a state limited in size and manpower, could extend its influence. Weizmann wanted to prove to the British that the Zionists were the most significant force on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. Weizmann did three things. First, he repeatedly used the term declaration when referring to the Balfour Letter. Second, he claimed that the declaration lay in Britain's own interests. Third, he maintained that as a British Jewish Zionist, he was the most qualified person to inculcate the declaration into the minds of the British forces in Palestine. However you look at it, none of these were givens. Furthermore, within just a few months, between March and September 1918, Weizmann turned his delegation to Palestine, which came to be known as the Zionist Commission, into the liaison between the British military government and the territory's Jewish population, and into a para-executive body that in its various incarnation over the next 3 decades became Israel's permanent government in 1949. By November 1918, the Balfour Declaration had become the operative British document regarding the conduct of British policy in the territory defined in 1922 as Palestine, after the designation of Transjordan originally part of the territory, as a separate entity. Weizmann astutely assented at the time to a British commitment to the Palestinian Arab cause in exchange for the inclusion of the Balfour Declaration verbatim in the mandate instrument ratified in July 1922 by the British Parliament and then by the League of Nations Council, which held formal sovereignty over Palestine. Weizmann harnessed the momentum produced by the Balfour Declaration to tighten the British Zionist connection and to fortify his own political standing within the Zionist movement. In July 1920, he was elected president of the World Zionist Organization, and on the diplomatic front, his task was to ensure that Balfour's letter continued to be treated as a political declaration binding on the British government. The question was, who would head the colonial office, which in 1921 assumed responsibility for Palestine from the Foreign Office? Weizmann had to ensure that the next prime minister would be committed to the declaration, and no less importantly, that the cabinet, parliament, and public opinion be favorable. What does ensure mean? What standing did Weizmann have in London? In 1922, it looked to many in Britain as if, quote, Chaim the Great, as the British press called him, were pulling the strings of British policy in the Middle East and in Palestine. That was an exaggeration, of course, but it is undeniable that nothing was done in this area without consulting first with Weizmann. In June 1921, Weizmann returned from a long visit to the United States. It seemed to him that the British government was not doing all it could to live up to the Balfour Declaration spirit. He asked Balfour, who was still Foreign Secretary, to invite the British political leadership for lunch. The leading figures in Parliament came, as did the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Colonial Secretary, and even the Prime Minister. Weizmann stood up and reprimanded them. None rose to put him in his place. In October 1922, it seemed that Weizmann's worst fears had come to pass. Lloyd George's government fell, the Conservatives formed the next government and ruled Britain, with the exception of one brief interval until 1929. The new government did not consider itself bound by the Balfour Declaration. The rug seemed to have been pulled from under Weizmann's political base and the Zionist movement. From 1922 to 1929, Weizmann had to get water from stone. He stopped talking about the Balfour Declaration. Instead, he spoke of the mandate, the charge that Britain received from the League of Nations. In Britain, he warned that the award of the mandate to the British should not be taken for granted. With the League, on the other hand, he spoke enthusiastically about Britain's administration of the mandate. He warned his colleagues in the Zionist movement against harboring illusions about there being an alternative to the Anglo-Zionist alliance. Ongoing Jewish immigration to Palestine would not have been possible without British rule. Zionist activity in Palestine, Weizmann argued, was possible only because of the letter that had become the declaration. It was this document that made it possible for the Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv, to grow. But then a crisis overwhelmed Weizmann, the Zionist movement and the Yishuv. Arab-Jewish tensions surrounded the Temple Mount worsened in 1928. In August 1929, a wave of Arab violence broke out. While the immediate trigger was a dispute over Jewish prayer at the Western Wall and Muslim fears that the Jews intended to take over their holy site above it, the deeper cause was the rapid growth of the Yishuv in the British incubator provided by the mandate and the Balfour Declaration. The British were caught unprepared, but finally put down the riots effectively. By then, however, more than 100 Jews had been killed by Arabs. A similar number of Arabs died, most of them killed by the British. It was a heavy blow to the Yishuv. Even worse was the about-face in British policy that grew out of it. The hesitancy that Britain had displayed since 1922 now bore fruit. In June 1929, a new Labour government came to power. In October 1930, Britain announced a new Palestine policy. It decided to retreat from the spirit of the Balfour Declaration in favor of a more balanced policy that would relieve the Palestinian Arabs of the threat of the establishment of a Jewish national home and promote the welfare of the exploited Arab Falachin, the peasant farmers, who had long been exploited by Arab landowners and who were now being ejected from the land they had farmed as tenants by the Jews who had purchased the property. The conclusions reached by the British were largely baseless. The experts who studied the situation, led by the new colonial secretary, Lord Pasfield, correctly diagnosed the outcome but failed to properly define the problem in the white paper they issued on October 20, 1930, and which became the basis for Britain's Palestine policy. Weizmann saw the either-or approach of Pasfield and his cohort as catastrophic. "You are mistaken," he angrily informed Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. "Pasfield," he said, "did not understand what he was talking about. You are harming the British interest, and as a result, the Zionist interest as well. You must immediately revoke this white paper," he demanded of the Prime Minister, and immediately submitted his resignation from the presidency of the World Zionist Organization. He quietly added that he understood very well the difficulties faced by the Labour coalition, and that he was not at all certain that it would survive this crisis. Not to speak of the fact, he warned, that there would be implications during the Prime Minister's upcoming trip to the United States. MacDonald needed no more than that. He appointed a new commission whose work reached a climax in a scene that is hard to comprehend even today. On February 13, 1931, Prime Minister MacDonald took the podium in Parliament in London. He declared that Britain would not retreat from its obligations in the spirit of the Balfour Declaration under the mandate, and that Pasfield's policy was, for all intents and purposes, a dead letter. The British government would even expand its cooperation with the Jewish Agency toward the establishment of a Jewish national home. These points were, at Weizmann's insistence, put into writing in a letter sent to him by the Prime Minister. He was no longer willing for a letter affirming the British commitment to Zionism to be sent to some Rothschild. The MacDonald letter, as it came to be called, was a historic declaration, no less important than the one named for Balfour. Never before or since has the British government openly announced that it was retracting its decision simply as a result of pressure from a citizen lacking any formal standing. But this time around, Weizmann did not manage to turn the MacDonald letter into the MacDonald Declaration. The British Empire had suffered more blows and its government was weaker than Lloyd George's war cabinet had been. The British needed to tread more carefully with the Arabs and with the Jews as well than it had to do at the end of World War I. The MacDonald Agreement of 1931 prevented the Balfour Declaration from sinking into oblivion. In the years 1932 to 1939, the Yishuv expanded from 17 to 37% of Palestine's population. The more than 400,000 Jews who lived in the country on the eve of World War II comprised a critical mass that could no longer be disregarded. In these years, a stable and full-fledged Jewish autonomous administration came into being, which served as the foundation for the establishment of the Jewish state a decade later. Weizmann's statecraft lay behind this. He was the great enabler of the Zionist project. Without the framework provided by the British, even the Jewish settlements project of establishing facts on the ground could not have been sustained. Two principal factors could have stood in the way of this success and destroyed it entirely: a final and complete break with Britain, and a manifestly hostile external enemy that ejected Britain from Palestine and physically attacked the flourishing Jewish community. Both prospects were clearly on the horizon. The first became a possibility in the 1930s, the second appeared in the 1940s. At the 17th Zionist Congress in July of 1931, Weizmann stumbled after he declared that he no longer believed in the aim of achieving a Jewish majority in Palestine as a precondition for the establishment of a Jewish national home there. It struck at the keystone of contemporary Zionist thinking across the spectrum. When the Congress passed a resolution rejecting the statement, Weizmann took it as a vote of no confidence and resigned. When Weizmann voiced his opposition to seeking a Jewish majority in Palestine in the summer of 1931, it was not a slip of the tongue. Since the severe crisis with Britain in 1929-30, Weizmann reckoned that it was no longer possible to disregard the Palestinian Arabs, and it would be both impossible and incorrect to rule over the Arabs. Of course, it was also unthinkable that the Arabs would rule over the Jews. The upshot of this principle of neither ruling nor being ruled was his objection to the impatience displayed by the revisionists who demanded the ultimate goal of Zionism, a Jewish state here and now. It was just froth, Weizmann said, and a danger to the Zionist idea. Nevertheless, his failure was largely a tactical one. The fact was that his approach was accepted by the Jewish Agency and Zionist executive during Nachum Sokolov's tenure from 1931 to 1935. This approach allowed him to formulate, in the years that followed, a plan based on his understanding that the mandate, to which he remained committed, stood on a rickety foundation. It was leading to a binational state. From there, he naturally moved toward parity, an idea according to which, under any political resolution, powers would be divided equally between the two peoples without regard to a proportion of Jews to Arabs in the Palestinian population. He ended by endorsing partition into two independent states, one Jewish and one Arab. Weizmann did not invent the idea of partition, but the minute he latched onto it, his standing in the Zionist movement and in Britain enabled him to take it from idea to practice. Weizmann concluded that the Zionist movement needed to go into a territorial diet regarding its aspirations, and that it would be best off by pursuing a policy of national maximalism and territorial minimalism. He proposed partitioning the country by giving the Jews the valleys and lowlands and the Arabs the central mountains, within the framework of a confederation of these two states with Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan, and Iraq, all under the protection of a British commissioner in Jerusalem. The winds of war in Europe doomed the partition plan promoted by Weizmann and Britain to failure. Weizmann was unable this time to persuade the British government not to reformulate its Palestinian policy. Aware of Zionism's weak position, in 1939, Weizmann led an approach that was best summed up after World War II broke out by his disciple, David Ben-Gurion, chairman of the Jewish Agency Executive. We will fight the white paper as if there were no Hitler, and we will fight Hitler as if there were no white paper. The binary nature of these words encompassed the historic success of Weizmann's policy during World War II. The Zionist movement and the Yishuv continued to fight Britain's Palestine policy primarily in the political theater, but most of their efforts were directed at the little they could do to aid Britain, which until 1941 stood almost alone against Germany and its allies. Weizmann established the political connection between the World Zionist Organization and the American government. He first met Calvin Coolidge in November 1926 and had access to all subsequent presidents, Herbert Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt, and Harry Truman, not to mention other senior figures in the White House, State Department, and the American legal and economic elite. Weizmann never gained in the State Department or White House the kind of cachet he enjoyed in Whitehall. He did not succeed in convincing the American government to provide financial support at the time of the economic crisis that threatened the Yishuv at the end of the 1920s. He also failed to obtain any significant American aid for Jewish refugees after the Nazis came to power. But his work in the United States produced significant results after World War II. He discerned the difficulties Britain faced and realized that its ally, the United States, was now calling the shots. Even though he was much weaker politically after the war, and even lost his formal position as president of the World Zionist Organization in December of 1946, Weizmann was able to take advantage of his international stature and his position in Britain and the United States to further the Zionist cause. No other Zionist figure could simultaneously reprimand Prime Minister Clement Attlee while at the same time demanding of President Harry Truman that he support Jewish immigration to Palestine and further the partition idea, this despite the fact that America's ally, Britain, believed that both were against its interests. Weizmann had Truman's ear in the critical years of 1945-48, when the American president could dramatically affect the way in which the British mandate would end. Weizmann was able to mold Truman's approach to partition, the refugee problem, the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry on Palestine, the future map of the Jewish state, and American support, formal and informal, for its establishment, laying the foundation for Israeli work in Washington. It was not Ben-Gurion, Weizmann's admirer and most important Zionist leader after 1947, who was responsible for Weizmann being shunted aside and forgotten. The establishment of the State of Israel effectively put an end to the World Zionist Organization that Theodor Herzl had founded and Weizmann fashioned into an effective institution. Zionism was no longer a transnational national movement. It was a sovereign state at a war with its neighbors. It was a new reality with new needs. Thank you very much.
I have a very difficult task. To speak after Jehuda is a very difficult task, but more so that he asked me to start from 1949 until now. That's unfair. And not only for the Arabs, but also for the Israelis. So I have another difficult task. I can't dissociate myself from the conflict. My generation and many of the audience here, the Arab-Israeli conflict for them is not the war over Kashmir or the war over islands in the Pacific. It's part of our lives and our future as well. But for me personally, I was born in November 9th, 1948. Exactly, in the middle of the road between the Balfour Declaration and where we are right now. I lived the conflict as a student, out for demonstrations, asking for war, to a soldier in the war, to a peacemaker, to a dissertation for my PhD, and finally to work with an Israeli and a Palestinian to produce a book about competing narratives. That was a very difficult task that took about 6 years to produce. Here I will relate to you my narrative of a century that started with a promise and ended with the scene we see today. I might even endeavor into the future and how it should be. The Balfour Declaration, and I will take one side of Yehuda, it's for the Arabs, is certainly an original sin. But I will start by saying that the original sin was not only for us, it was almost of everybody. The British was, I don't know what the right word to use here, were distributing promises to everyone. They started with the Arabs. Through letters of Hussein McMahon, they promised the Arab of a complete Arab kingdom in the Fertile Crescent. And they promised the French through Sykes-Picot, which was last year, we were celebrating or commemorating its 100 years, to divide all the Levant and the Fertile Crescent. The British were actually distributing the land of the region, the Near East then that was named, to Jews, Arabs, French, Greeks, and other depending on how the Great War panned out. It was a tactical and strategic moves. The British promises at the end were all contradictory and indeed conflicting. Still, the Balfour Declaration, with all its repercussions, has started historical processes that no party has a control over. In a letter sent from President Nasser of Egypt to President Kennedy in 1960, he summarized the Arab opinion of the existential nature of the conflict by describing the Balfour Declaration as being made from those who do not own the British, to those who do not deserve, the Jews, without the consent of those who own and deserve, the Palestinians. It was the clearest narrative that formulated the essence of the conflict that's existential and does not leave much for a compromise. But that was not all. Kenneth Waltz, giving notice to the importance of the unintended consequences of major historical events. In many ways, the conflict and the creation and the establishment of the State of Israel have been instrumental in deeply affecting the political evolution of the Arab countries surrounding Israel. The Arab-Israeli conflict caused a portion of Arab Renaissance of the 19th century that started with rebellion against the Ottoman Empire onwards, till the emergence of industrialization and modernization in the Arab world. The formation of Israeli state had caused the reverse to the civic streams of liberalism and democratization in the Arab world in general. A number of Arab countries, foremost Egypt, was the frontrunner of converging into the global liberal and democratic trends. More, the emergence of the Zionist parties as representatives of Jewish nationalism paved the road to the emergence of a different forms of Islamist, not Islamic, Islamist nationalism. Both contributed to the formation of diverse types of religious and nationalist radicalism. None of this should indicate that the Zionist movement and the creation of the State of Israel were the sole reason for how the political future of Arab countries came to being. For sure, both have their share of responsibility. Other historical and socio-economic factors may have a larger role. However, as we look back at the history of the conflict, there are lessons to be learned. The first lesson we learn is that the creation of realities on the ground has been always stronger than legal or moral arguments. This helps identify a basic difference between the Jewish and Palestinian political elite. The difference does not just reside solely in the fact that Jews managed to appropriate and settle on land, but also in their ability to build political, economic, and social institutions. Lesson 2 is that military might, however strong, has limits, and that it cannot, in and of itself, achieve the objectives of any of the parties. The Arabs failed in 1948 and 1967, but the Israelis failed too in 1956 and 1973. Moreover, the Israelis failed to repress by force the first and second Palestinian intifadas that only subsided due to political and diplomatic efforts. Military victories sometimes proved to be counterproductive. In 1982, Israel achieved one of its greatest victories when it invaded Lebanon, and even occupying the first Arab capital, Beirut. The result of the war was the birth of the most resilient threat to Israel, represented by Hezbollah, which carried the Iranian reach to the Mediterranean and consequently to the Israeli borders. The third lesson is that the Arab-Israeli conflict has a persistence and intrinsic impetus that has enabled it to keep going even as the whole world changing. From colonization to decolonization, from multipolar world to bipolar world to unipolar world, there was a resilience of the conflict and its ability to adapt to changing circumstances. This gives us lesson 4, which is that major shifts in the course of the conflict only occurred when there was direct dialogue between the Arabs and the Jews, and between the Arab states and Israel. Examples are to be found in the Camp David talks and the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement that ended the Israeli occupation of Sinai, and then in the Jordanian-Israeli peace agreement. Between these two landmarks were the Oslo Accords that led to the establishment of the first Palestinian National Authority on Palestinian land, creating a Palestinian reality on the ground. Unfortunately, this reality is not only threatened by Israeli power, but also by the Palestinians' tendency to forget that their goal is to establish a state that's not based on the rift between the West Bank and Gaza. Nor can a Palestinian state be established while in adversity with Israel. Lesson 5. The prolongation of the Arab-Israeli conflict with its Palestinian core has reduced the immunity of the Arab countries to meet not only developmental challenges, but also for them and Israel to face strategic perils from within and from without the region. At the present decade, the anatomy of the Middle East has shown how for non-Arab Israeli contradictions can bring marked challenges to both sides. A word about the future. The 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, the 70 years since the Partition Resolution, and the 50 years since the June War, all tell the story of a huge tragedy, but one that compels us to read it again rather than to lament over the ruins. More importantly, perhaps, is the need to reread with an eye fixed on the future. The Arab Peace Initiative may be the key to determining how to arrange things in the region that has never experienced order unless some outside powers imposed it, as was the case with Britain and its promises, and the USA and its troubled endeavors. After all, what is there to prevent us, the now independent peoples of the region, from undertaking this task today? In 2002, I was invited to the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University in Israel. After my presentation, one in the audience asked, "When do you think the Arabs will stop hating Israelis?" It was a tough question that took me time to get out of its shock. My answer, however, was the Arab hate of Israel will stop when the Middle East region feels that it is better off with Israel than in being without it. My historical example was Singapore, a country with 74% of majority Chinese origin settlers society, and the rest are the Malay and Indian origins minorities. The country was separated in 1960 from the Malaysian mainland and a vast region of Malayan race. Singapore made peace with its mainland and the rest of the region by providing an example of economic miracle, technological prowess, and cultural understanding for fast-growing regional development. It is understood that historical and geographic analogies are imperfect. Yet, the Singaporean example is the closest and most insightful case in the Middle East situation. It shows that peace is not only possible, but it can be also prosperous. Prosperity is an interactive process, free of fear and insecurities. It is the job of the societies concerned to be involved into an honest process of self-examination that's free of blaming the other and finger-pointing for a scapegoat of historical responsibilities. Understanding the limits of power can be a first step forward. Israelis and Palestinians have to understand that a century of negative interactions did not leave them for any place else to go. They are in reality sharing the same land and probably the same destiny. Lately, Hussein Agha and Ahmed Khalidi wrote an insightful, though pessimistic, article in the New Yorker titled "The End of the Road, the Decline of the Palestinian National Movement." They argued, and I quote, "The contemporary Palestinian national movement, founded and led by Yasser Arafat and embodied by the BA, Fatah, and PLO over the past half-century, is reaching its end. As its institutions wither and its leaders fade away, there is no obvious successor to take its place," end of quote. The piece continues to make strong arguments for this regrettable conclusion, which entails not only the fading away of the possibility of a Palestinian independent state, but also consequently the possibility of a Palestinian-Israeli peace based on a two-state formula. However, Agha and Khalidi do not seem to be totally desperate. They see a budding direction emerging from the combined effect of the diminishing prospects for a negotiating two-state settlement and the increasingly blurred borders between Arabs and Jews in the territory. Israeli settlements may have all but erased the 1967 borders in one direction, but 50 years of occupations have helped to erase the border in the opposite direction as well. After decades of fraught relations between the Palestinians and Israel's Palestinian citizens, the past few years have seen growing interactions between political and intellectual elites across the borders. Add this dimension with its notice of the resilience of the Palestinian identity among Israel's Palestinian citizens and their growing understanding of Israel's democratic portico may lead to a remarkable transformation, not only in the re-emerging of a new brand of Palestinian nationalism, but also, and probably more important, to a resolution of the long-enduring conflict. In fact, another side I probably should here bring, UC Alpha, last article to the Brookings, he said exactly the following. By 2017, Israel and Palestine were solely sliding down, slipping slope towards a single political entity. Aside from the word sliding, which it has a negative connotation, I will say ascending, probably, to be one political entity. In fact, Israeli-Palestinian interactions have gone far beyond their demographic and geographic necessities to include economic, religious, and security requirements. In reality, both peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, though divided, are living within one realm. The word realm I borrowed from Game of Thrones, by the way. Just, you learn a new word all the time. Within one realm, that the livelihood of each is totally dependent on the other's strategic moves. The interdependence between the two sides should not be hidden under the carpet of pronounced hate and antagonisms. In fact, Israel and Palestinian territories are living under one labor, trade, tax, and currency active markets. Security interdependence is no less viable as the Palestinian security establishment that matured by Israel, the US, and major European and Arab parties did not only contribute to Palestinian governance, but also to Israeli security. Both sides, each one in its own way, have faced this decade a very troubled region that's living through the results of the Arab Spring, the American involvement and withdrawal from the Middle East, the expansive and aggressive Iranian posture, and the terrorism of Islamist terrorist organizations. All have given the Palestinian-Israeli realm a strategic outlook that takes away from their inherent historical contradictions. One realm and a partitioned state might open the gate for a new approach towards the resolution of the conflict and hence new prospects for the Middle East. To conclude, I recall few lines from Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He said, "What if you slept? And what if you, in your sleep, you dreamed? And what if, in your dream, you went to heaven? And there you plucked a strange and beautiful flower. And when you awoke, you have that flower in your hand. What then?" Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much to both of our panelists for eye-opening reflections on the past. And what we're going to do now is take questions from the audience for the panelists. We're a little bit early. They're okay, so that's fine. So what we're going to do, we're going to take questions in rounds of 3. We're going to take a question from Arizona first, then from Tufts, and then from Brandeis. And we'll present them to the speakers. You can respond, and then we'll go for another round as time permits. So why don't we start with our colleagues at the University of Arizona. We don't have them visually, but we do have them.
Okay, I think we're speaking now from the University of Arizona. And I would point out that we are in Tucson, not Phoenix.
My apologies.
That's all right. We sort of make a point of it here. This is my question for the second speaker. The single system, the single political system that he outlined at the end of his talk, assuming parity for both Jews and Arabs, would essentially eliminate a Jewish homeland. Could he comment further on that?
But Abdel, we're going to collect 3, okay? So you
Okay.
can answer as you choose. Thank you so much. Excellent question. Let's now turn to the Fletcher School at Tufts.
Hello, greetings from Fletcher. We are at Medford, and we have an almost full room who are very interested, and we don't have a question, but I have a comment to add, which could be part of a question. This is Nadim Shahadi, by the way, from the Fire Center. I was very interested by Professor Reinhard's talk, especially when he said about Weizmann proposing a sort of a Lebanese solution in the 1930s. This was at the same time when the Lebanese were thinking of a similar solution. So in a way, my question is that if Weizmann's Lebanese solution didn't work, it didn't work in Lebanon much either. So is there a comment on that?
Is there what?
A comment about that. Okay, and now let's turn to our audience here. And please raise your hand if you'd like a question. We'll have one of our student assistants come and hold a microphone before you. So do we have a question or comment from the audience?
Hi, so this is for Mr. Sayed Ali. My question is as follows. So you said somebody asked you when Arabs would sort of stop hating Israel, and you replied that it was when the Arab world felt better off with Israel than without it. So my question to you is this: is that purely, in the economic sense, like in the case of Singapore, where both countries, or both Singapore and like Malaysia, benefited from sort of trade and open markets and stuff, or does it also have like a political dimension? So, for instance, shared opposition to Iran or to terrorism or something. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, which of you would like to speak first?
Go for it.
Well, I have two questions. One about the parity of the, nationalism of both sides. Nationalism is a cognitive process. It's something, if some people decided that they are a nation and they have, and in many ways, in the analysis of nationalism and nations, the Jewish experience is quite unique. And I must say it's a miraculous way. And it is a product of a historical process that probably started from passing over from Egypt to, the pogroms to Nazi experience. There is something that melted down, Jews coming from different countries in the world in many ways with different culture. So there is something there. Palestinians in their part, actually they were there, they were owning land there. They were living the same experience of the Ottoman period with the rest of the region. And with post First World War, beginning of state system in the region, Palestinian nationalism started to emerge. And they were willing, actually, over the 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, to fight for it and pay blood for it. The difference is, as I said, who started first, who built institutions more, who was more agile and in relationship with others. But the identity and self-definition is something for people to decide. What they are, what is their high values, and so forth. The issue is that we have a very unique situation between two nations that happened that they are living together, actually. I mean, originally, there was Jews in Palestine, a minority, and now they are becoming a majority. And still, between the river and the Mediterranean, we have 12 million people. 6 million of them are Arab Palestinians, and the other are Israeli Jews. So 6 million with 6 million, you have to manage one way, either to continue of what we are doing, waiting for the next war to happen, or we solve it. So here there is the issue is subjective in many ways to decide there is a parity here or not parity here. If the Israelis say that they are a nation, they are a nation. Yeah, for me, they are a nation. And
it was given by the UN and confirmed. They were given that as a nation. They don't take their nation, they were given a nation, sir. Quoted 3 things in the text.
Actually, the partition resolution is all about that, recognizing two nations. One of them succeeded to make its own state, the other didn't until now. That is the essence of the partition resolution, which takes me to the Singaporean question, which is still see it as a good example, actually, because partitioning countries was one of the ways in the post Second World War world is to solve problems. Korea was partitioned, Vietnam was partitioned, Germany was partitioned, India was partitioned, and Palestine was partitioned. So it was the mood of solving problem is to answer the lady that brought the kid or the infant to King Solomon about, competition with another lady is to cut the child into two. I mean, there wasn't the mother that say, no, he's not mine, because they love, the kid more than what happened, there was a lot of blood in it. But in history, we cannot make it twice, once with blood and once without it. So I got the Singaporean example here. It was cut out of Malaysia of today. And instead of living both sides between the little island and the big mainland of Malaysia, into a continuous state of war. And there was a little tension about for 2 decades after the independence of both. But they found that making money is much better. You know, that technology, and actually Singapore started first, was one of the first tigers that we have in that region. It is a real miracle, economic, and they are very even-handed. I visited there several times. I mean, they have 6 days of vacations every year, 2 for, for Chinese, and 2 for Muslims, and 2 for Indians. I mean, there is a lot of equality over there and opportunity. Opportunity is one way out of major conflicts.
To talk about the evolution of the Balfour Declaration or the Zionist movement at any period from 17, you can take it from any time, 1880s, whatever it is, to the establishment of the State of Israel in 20 minutes is a difficult task. But since I'm afraid of Eva, I did my best. So there's a lot I didn't talk about. The period we're talking about, the 1920s and 1930s, is a period in which lots of entities grasped for solutions. There was a solution that came up in the 1920s already of the creation of a legislative council in which the Arabs, in fact, would have had the upper hand in making decisions. The Arabs didn't go for it. 15 years later, they changed their minds, but then the Zionists didn't want to collaborate. When I talked about Weizmann's idea of by the way, it was not only Lebanon, it was also Iraq, Transjordan, Syria. He was just grasping at some solutions. What is not known is that, and I suspect it was in the back of his mind, is that Weizmann was suggested by Churchill, no less, to become the High Commissioner for Palestine. And I suspect in the back of my mind that he thought of himself as sort of running the whole show in the Middle East. But it was not serious. It was not about to happen. It was much larger than Lebanon. It was a regional issue, which the Zionist movement, or the British for that matter, would not have compressed into the issue of Palestinian Zionist conflict.
Okay. Well, why don't we go for another round, and let's reach out to, again, our partners at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Would you want to present another question to our panelists? Do we have the connection to Tucson? Yes? No response. I don't know if we're connecting.
Arizona, you're muted right now if you do want to say anything.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So my question is, in an era when young people are reassessing their relations to Zionism, how does Zionism remain relevant or important to this group?
I'm going to have to repeat that.
Can you repeat that question closer to the microphone?
In an era when young people are reassessing their relation to Zionism, how does Zionism remain relevant or important to this group?
Yeah, it's incomprehensible as far as I can tell. Young people's relationship to Zionism.
Yes, how does Zionism remain relevant or important to this group?
Okay. Does that
Say it again. Stand.
In an era when people are reassessing their relation to Zionism, how does Zionism remain relevant or important to this?
How does it
Zionism still
relevant or important
to the new generations, or it's something of the past?
Are you asking if Zionism is still important for young people? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
okay, good.
That's after 49. Abdel, Monem, you want to answer? No, I'm going to answer it. I'm going to make an exception. There's a lot that has been written by social scientists in certainly the last 2 decades, about young people, by which I assume you mean young Jews. I don't think Arabs have become Zionists lately.
They are not allowed.
At least not openly. But a lot of commentary on young people, young Jews being moving away from Zionism, from the State of Israel. Actually, it turns out that in the latest surveys that have been made, actually some of them by faculty at Brandeis University, it turns out that that is not true. Now, I think that most people don't even understand what Zionism is all about. And I think that Zionism has really come to mean a relationship with the State of Israel. I think that's the sort of, in general terms, is what is meant by that. It depends when that question is being asked. Right now, there's a lot of unhappiness with the State of Israel by many people, not only in America, but in Europe and elsewhere, for all kinds of reasons which I don't want to go into. But the fact is that the number of young people who come to Israel, young Jews who come to Israel, has only increased, it's not decreased. And I don't think we're actually going to know the answer to this for another 10 years because the social scientists clearly do not agree. And I'm not a social scientist.
Okay, let's turn back to Tufts and see if our colleagues in Tufts have another question to pose to our panelists.
Yeah, hi, my name's Kelsey Goodman. I'm a second-year graduate student at the Fletcher School. My question is about American leadership in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and in the hopefully one day a negotiated solution. Over the past several decades, we've seen a sort of an assumption of all our presidents that there should be some form of American leadership on this issue. And I was wondering if you ever think it's time to question that, considering how the last few rounds of negotiations have ended up. Like, is there still a role for American leadership, or should this be something that the United States should take a step back from?
Great question. And now anyone from the Brandeis community who would like to speak? Sir. Wait, just going to bring you a mic.
There's someone in the end as well.
So my name is Mohammed. I'm on my master's program here in coexistence and conflict resolution. And my question is for Dr. Abdel Said regarding the ascendance to a common state. The term that he coined, it's a question and a thought. How can we reach this point if the psychological narrative that is used in the Arab world does not allow for the people to culturally normalize their relations with Israel? And I mean, you can have a peace agreement, but then the normalization for relations like visit tourism is hindered by many problems that face the people to normalize. Even the ones who are even curious are accused of being spies, agents, or people with the Zionist agenda. And this in itself was not, I think, the case in Singapore, where people are actually sharing lots of common cultural roots that didn't affect them living together. Maybe in Israel and in the Arab world we share lots of foods, but then comes again the fight, is it Israeli food or is it an Arab food? And I've seen the case in similar other countries also, between Armenia and Turkey, because I lived in Azerbaijan and I was exposed to the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict a lot. It's the same problem. Is this a musical instrument from Azerbaijan or from Armenia or from Georgia? It's from the Caucasus, but they don't say that. And that's a psychological factor. So my question, to be brief, what do you think the governments should do in 2017, and I mean for the Arab governments, the stable ones at least, or the ones that are remaining, fully functioning, to address this issue of planting coexistence into the educational systems of the Arabs? Thank you very much.
Good. Abdel Monem, do you want to respond to that?
Actually, can I?
You want to think a little bit?
Oh, both of them.
Whichever, go ahead.
Okay, I just will start by the issue about American leadership. American leadership is indispensable for any movement in the Middle East. I mean, all the successes that happened in peace treaties, it has a lot of American influence. And many ending of wars and trying to have a ceasefire and stuff like this, there was an American effort. Is America now can do that? I'm not sure. I mean, America now is busy with a lot of things, and I'm not sure that that the United States in the mood even to get into another endeavor. So the only thing the United States can do is just to try to keep the situation cool without any conflagration of another kind of a conflict. On the issue of that Mohammed talked about, actually that's more complex. Sometimes we think, as bad as it is, the Arab-Israeli conflict, that's the only conflict that ever happened in the world. I mean, what happens in Charlottesville in the United States, in which people are fighting over statutes and naming of the street and the flags of the Confederacy, and still remember very vividly what happened, more than 100 years ago. Conflicts is part of life, and sometimes it's bloody, and sometimes, who can think on the Israeli side? We read a lot of people on the Israeli right in particular, that having peace with Arab countries cannot be guaranteed because they change their systems and the people hate us. We have, for more or less, 40 years of peace with Israel. We have some trade not so different from the trade that's happening in the Middle East, which is not too much anyway. At one time, we have 2 flights a day between Tel Aviv and Cairo. The Arab Spring and the chaos that we have in the region have, complicated a lot of things. So we have to deal with the conflict like any other conflict. In the same time, that's part of nature. But also it has a price. And now countries in the region, there are much more challenges. I mean, what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Iraq. Now, we used in my generation that we have, when you mention the word refugees, it means the Palestinians. Now we have Iraqi refugees, we have Syrian refugees, Yemeni refugees, Libyan refugees. So, the region is torn apart. We used to say that a region torn apart, that's for the interest of Israel. But Israel, now with every more weak country, it is more to have non-state actors that are attacking Israel. So Israel became the weakness did not lead to the strength of Israel per se, but more threats against Israel and against other Arab countries as well. So now there are a new completely situation in which the region is in serious difficulty and in serious challenges to all the parties concerned, particularly the parties that stayed as state, like Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, or the Gulf countries, the countries that could hold, in facing the big storm of the Arab Spring, and I will say the American invasion of Iraq, the American withdrawal from Iraq, and also the type of politics and policies that is followed by Iran and other regional powers, Iran and Turkey and others. So in that sense, I feel we have common challenges. And either we face it or not. I am saying, now you talk about what Arab governments should do. I will say Arab government in their side, we have to take the path to peace. I mean, that is the one to be declared over and over again. And we have an offer to Israel that we didn't have a response yet, called the Arab Peace Initiative, which it has a good deal. Get recognition, normalization with 22 states, in exchange for withdrawal and the establishment of the Palestinian state. But that's a very big title. It has a lot of details to be filled and duties. I mean, Palestinians, there is no way they can have their state with adversity with Israel. I mean, they are neighbors. You can't be in adversity with a neighbor and in the same time expect that it will allow you to have a state. There is contradiction here. So the Palestinians got to get their acts together and also to make their case. Israel, in the same time, I think it has a lot of Singaporean traits. It has technology, it has prosperity, it has money, it has connection with the West, it has a lot of things. If it really could, actually it has done some of it and it's working with Jordan, is to provide it with technology for desalination of seawater. But we need something in a Singaporean volume, not one project here and another project here to use it for talking that we are doing something. Israel, its part, got to do, but also Israel is a complex society, complex politics. There is a lot of things got to be worked out. But I don't think that to continue in the same path that we were into it will help anybody. Actually, it will help the enemies of all settled societies in the region.
I think if you look at what happens every time an outside force, whether it's America or somebody else, tries to resolve, let's say, the Middle East conflict, what happens? Both with this current administration, which is now, I read today in the paper, is resolving the Qatar-Saudi Arabia conflict, which is not going to happen. And the former administration that tried 3 days after it came into power to do the same, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to play the game of what if, but I think there's a very simple equation here that is not yet been mentioned, and which is very simple. You know, there's a book that by a friend of mine, it's called It's All About Who. And I think that we forget about the role of leadership in any country in making change happen. I mean, look at Sadat, you look at any kind of leader, any kind of major change in any country, any time in history. It took leadership to do it. If you don't have the leadership, nothing is going to happen. It's a very simple proposition. And you can talk about all the political issues, the economic issues, all the intrastate problems. It takes leadership. And whether it's India or Indonesia or the Arab-Israeli conflict or Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it's the same thing.
So actually, I'm going to take the prerogative and ask two questions, if I may. Following up on just that, Yehuda, I wanted to ask you precisely about leadership, because you emphasized the role of Chaim Weizmann in the Yishuv. And many of us are distraught that there is not such inspiring leadership in Israel today to make the big choices that need to be made to move the whole process forward. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, maybe we are idealizing the Yishuv period and not recognizing how deeply divided and contentious it was, and we just say, oh, there were these wonderful leaders that brought the community together and advanced the cause of Zionism. But, I mean, are there conditions today that you think undermine the emergence of a strong leader who could really advance this process? Or are we just, I mean, what's different today from, before you answer, wait, no, I'm also going to give Abdel Monem a question to think about, and that is about the role of global forces. It kind of builds on what was asked before. The role of global forces in fostering a mutual understanding across the divide. Do you think that global forces play less or more of a role today than they did in the past 100 years, which you talked about? So it's...
If you think that during the Yishuv period was an idyllic, nice period, everybody got along, they had a good time together, and Weizmann just did whatever he wanted to do, let me just, again, I can't go into details, but you know, when Weizmann came to Palestine in late 1920s and 1930s, he had to have bodyguards because people said that it was said that he was going to be assassinated. And indeed, throughout the period of the Yishuv, the kind of rifts, the kind of policies, the murder of Jews by other Jews was not an uncommon thing. I think that the other thing is to look at it in the larger context. And of course, since I'm writing the biography of Chaim Weizmann, I'm suspect that I'm idealizing Weizmann. But think of all the promises that Britain made during World War I, to Arabs, to Armenians, to Kurds, to others. None of them were kept by Britain. So the role of the individual here was really critical. And I believe that today, too, the role of individual. I mean, a rabbin who changed his mind on the issue of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, emerged as somebody who promoted peace. Peres too, who was involved in lots of other things that were anything but peace, changed. So the role of individuals, unless they get killed, plays an important role even today. I think currently we don't have it.
And why? But no insights on why. That's just chance, whether someone emerges.
I don't think it's chance. I think it has to do with the individual's own assessment of what is important to him and to the country. And the two don't necessarily always fall on the same scale.
Abdel, Monem, thoughts about whether global powers have more of a role today than 50 years ago?
Our starting point today was the Balfour Declaration. I mean, that's a global power at the time. It was a unipolar world. Britain was the greatest power. And it did, as Jehuda just said, give everybody promises. But that is legacy of global powers. I mean, if you are a global power, then you do whatever you want. You make promises to be unkept or violated in one way or another as far as interests will take you. So, although I enjoy blaming the British for everything, but it is really part of international politics that we cannot. It is actually, if any fault, it comes on the population themselves of the region. But they allow themselves to ask for two contradictory things. One is to be independent, and in the same time, it's to be very dependent on global powers as consumers of power. They take arms, they take aid, they take economic assistance or whatever. So once you allow these kind of tools of manipulation to work, then it will be a kind of hypocrisy to say, well, the global power are to blame. We cannot reinvent the international system. However, there is something new in the international system happening now, which is really transcends the United States, Russia, China, and others, which is technology. I know for a fact that on the Facebook, there are circles of Arab and Israeli Jews and Palestinians who are talking together. In the midst of post-Oslo agreement, we attempted in Egypt, Jordan, Israel, to get something called the International Alliance for Peace. We started talking here and there, trying to find solutions to a very complex problems. I think the attempt to make solutions to intricate problems is not totally impossible. In fact, there is always room. In fact, there is always room on the ground. No Arab knows, for instance. I mean, it is not something everybody knows, but shekel is the currency of the Palestinian territories. So the Palestinians are completely on dependence on Israeli central bank. That is something called customs union, in economic terms. I mean, something took Europe ages to do is to unify the currency. The currency is, call it pound, call it dinar, call it rial, call it shekel. At the end, everybody will be exchanged for the dollar. So it is, you get to the bottom line of it. Where really the leadership of Palestinians take their kids or mothers when they come into serious illness, Israeli hospitals. So there is something that's going on. I mean, Israel, when it tell you all of a sudden, we will stop sending the taxation to the Palestinians, of Palestinian trade to the outside world. What? Israel now is acting like a tax collector to the Palestinians. That is a reality. I mean, and all the international blame the Israelis, that is their money. Give them their money. So they will give their money once somebody interferes. So here, there is a lot to say. 150,000 Palestinians cross the border every day to go and work for Israel. Israel was complaining all the time that these guys might be a threat to the Israeli security. They tried everybody, from Thailand, from Ethiopia, from Africa, from everywhere. At the end, they found the Palestinians are the best, they are good, and they do their job well, and they are very close by. So here, there is something there. And we got to just have the courage to say it. That they are, I'm not saying that, and that's an answer to some of the questions, what the modalities of this? One realm and partitioned state is a confederacy. Something of, there are on the science, there's something called the political science, and also history. Give us million kinds of examples that we can give and take and play with to find finally the right formula that the people reach by themselves. All the Palestinians need somebody like, what's the name, the Prime Minister, Fayyad, somebody to build institutions strong that they can deal with the Israeli institutions and come, and they will can strike a deal. I'm not saying that anything is easy, but also our situation is not an easy situation. Global powers complicate at this moment what we have, because we have an international system that's new. I think also after Donald Trump came to power in the United States is different. It's not the country that I know. It's not the country that I know since 1977. I mean, I have been in this country for that long and coming frequently. So we have now an international system, but as I said, it has also elements of economics and technology that allow a better and more advanced relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis and the Arab world and Israel.
Okay, good. Well, let's do one last round, and then we'll call it a day. Again, let's reach out to Arizona. A last question for our panelists.
Hello, my name is Belinda Barrington. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. You have the panelists, particularly Dr. Syed Ali. Okay, is it better when I'm standing here?
And speak slowly.
Okay. Dr. Syed Ali has mentioned a number of reasons that having a two-state solution is problematic, including the lack of parity of the two parties in terms of economics, in terms of education, in terms of international political pull or influence. First question, how would you think that a confederacy would be possible given those same problems? And second question, if the world should now move towards looking to a single state rather than a partition, rather than a two-state solution or a confederacy, how would the remaining concern of many people that there needs to be a Jewish state be taken care of?
Okay, thank you. That's an excellent question. Do we want to postpone that for a later panel, or should we take that up, Shai? What do you think? Okay, fine. Thank you. Great question. Let's go on to our audience in Tufts. One last question for our panelists.
Yes. Hello. Mohammed Nabil from Fletcher School. So as the second speaker said, for most Arabs, the creation of Israel and the Balfour Declaration was the original sin. So he doesn't think that the second original sin for most Arabs, maybe apart from the Egyptian establishment and the military power, was the Camp David agreement between Egypt and Israel. I have also a comment on the daily collaboration between Palestinian and Israeli right now. With the inequality of powers between the two, between occupying state and occupiers, can we describe it really as collaboration, or is it something else? I can be provocative here and said, is it the same as what we saw during the Second World War II between the Nazi regime occupies in France and the Vichy regime in France? Thank you.
Okay. All right, and let's take a final question from Brandeis. Any students? We want to prioritize students if we could.
The one on the back is...
It's not a student. He's not a student.
Here, that's David.
He is persistent.
I know.
Did you want to ask a question, David?
If I qualify as a student.
No, you don't qualify as a student, but you're younger.
Ian Lustig, a political scientist, had an interesting op-ed in the New York Times about 4 years ago on the two-state illusion. But at the end of that, he makes a provocative comment that in a one-state solution, you may see political strange bedfellows. In other words, the salient cleavage in a one state may not be Jewish, non-Jewish, Israeli, Palestinians, and you could see different cleavages come to the fore. So he suggests secular Palestinians and secular Israelis might become political allies. Ultra-Orthodox Jews and Islamists might become allies. Somebody made a joke about food, right? But that's food shared by some Jews, those from Arab lands. That could be a common basis of an identity. And so my question is for both speakers. Abdel Monem mentioned a lot of that border in many ways has been transcended and groups are communicating online and offline. Do you see them communicating not necessarily as Israelis and Palestinians, but as people of a particular social class or people of a particular ideology or different cleavages becoming prominent that could be the basis of something? And then my question it's pre-49. Do you see historical precedents from the pre-49 period where the residents of the land were not thinking of themselves first and foremost politically as Jews and non-Jews, but as, I'm sure communists were one, but did you see other sort of interests coming up that could be the basis of political groupings or alliances that could be rediscovered or reinvented by political actors in the future?
Okay. Abdel Monem, do you want to go first? Do you want to respond to
Just last point, there was always communications before 1948 between Arabs and Jews, Egyptians in particular and Jews. And we know that the head of Cairo University, which was established in 1908, attended the opening of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in 1920. And there was, a lot of interaction that's taking place between the two sides. It continued actually until the 1940s. After that, it was cut off by the development that happened.
Let me respond to that before you go on.
Sure, go ahead.
1925, by the way, opening of the university. But it's not a simple answer. It's an issue that evolved over time. You have to understand before the 1920s, the way the British, for one, dealt with the Arabs was as imperialist powers have dealt with so-called natives all along. Bribery and other means of that sort. Or dealing with princes or landowners or people who had some power in some of them not residents of Palestine but owning land in Palestine, etc. So it was an evolution. By the late 1920s, 30s, there are in fact small groups of Jews and Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, who meet to discuss issues of coexistence and peace. The names here won't mean anything. These were mostly Western European Jews who were involved in this, mostly German Jews, I am glad to mention this, who dealt with in these issues, mostly people who were professors at the Hebrew University, but it was a tiny group, as you mentioned, the communist groups as well. But that was an evolution. As I mentioned before, it took Weizmann until the 1920s to sort of understand that there was a Palestinian national movement that had actually been created already prior to World War I that needed to be reckoned with. But by that time, it was much too late. Go ahead.
Probably immediately those who talked about the Egyptian-Israeli peace as being another historical sin. If that's so, I will ask God not to forgive. I mean, was one of the best things that ever happened to Egypt, and I hope it happened also one of the best things to Israel. So it is not a sin at all. I mean, it was the beginning of the road that I am talking about right now, which is how to distinguish between putting two formulas together. I am not saying that we have to be in one state. I mean, I'm not advocating that for a variety of reasons that we don't have time to discuss. However, I'm talking about one realm. Actually, the Palestinians and Israelis created one realm. It is up to us and the leadership to recognize it and find it where it's to develop it. Some of the developments already taking place in a variety of ways. I mean, the fact that now talking about how to find water to the Palestinians, for instance, or creating an airport or a port, other possibilities that allow all the sides to benefit is already there, and but it is not enough. It is not Singaporean in magnitude and volume. So here you have to keep in mind that I'm not talking about a cancellation of the two-state issue. But I'm trying to overcome the difficulties that's facing the two-state by creating common interests that at the end it will generate in itself how to deal with the problems of the two-state solutions. One-state solution, it cannot be based on the cantonization of the Palestinian territories. So the only way, if you make a confederate relationship in which, how do you can justify having a state without an army or without an airspace, unless it is part of a community that's called confederacy that is not necessarily allow some of its parties to get that kind of independence without having these kinds of constraints on that independence. So here, I'm saying here, not to as a kind of manipulation, but to find a solution. Some places in the world and in history, people who are dogged in the cleavages battle, cleavages, contradictions, class struggle, all things, you can always keep, the logic or how long people can fight each other. I mean, that is the easiest. That's the story of history. But there was always people like Sadat, like Rabin, after he just tried to understand, because he was a great mind, that he was willing until his death or assassination to learn and to recognize. And when you look at the nitty-gritty of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty and what happened in Camp David, it's really, I will say, hundreds of problems. Hundreds of problems, and each one was, solved by a piece of human genius. I mean, what do you do with the Israeli right wing? Somebody call Sharon and tell him accept the issue of removing the settlements, which was something in fighting. Things Begin said, these things I can't put it to the Knesset. They are not going to accept it. So the Americans worked their ways through the Israeli Knesset. So we kept working, that, you can go and not to push anyone to make everyone to vote its own consciousness. They did. And the treaty and the accords won with one vote. So it is politics that can take people to kill each other. It can take them not to kill each other and find ways of cooperation. And there is politics that keep people digging in their history what kind of bitterness and hate they got.
That's great. Abdel Monem, I'm going to cut you off there.
Sorry.
Just because we have to keep so closely to our schedule with our people on the other line. But this is great. It's a great idea to pick up with in our next session about politics and how it's all about politics. So thank you very much for both of our panelists. Okay, now we have just a heads up to all. We have about half an hour to have something to eat. You can outside or upstairs. And we all have to be back by 2:10 for the next panel.